My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
Noun phrases and characters. I've talked about this in a number of videos now, about what the basic grammatical sentence in English is. It consists of two parts. There's the noun phrase subject and the verb phrase predicate. And the verb phrase predicate consists of a verb plus whatever completes that verb. Now that said, our prototypical grammatical sentence will typically have an actor in the subject position and an action in the verb position, and oftentimes in our prototypical sentences, the action is performed on something, on an actee. So we can fill in those positions with something like, the wolf ate the pig. And this brings us to Joseph Williams' principle that our subject and our verb, those are fixed positions. We don't have any control over that. For it to be a grammatical sentence of English, there has to be a subject, there has to be a verb. But what we do have control over is what we put in those positions. And what we want to do is get characters into the subject position and actions into the verb position. In a previous video, I've talked about getting actions into the verb position. Now we're going to focus on characters. Let's think about a good story. When we think about children's stories, those are nice examples of what a prototypical story should be, because we like to keep children's stories simple and to the point. Any good story has to have characters. So think about the Three Little Pigs. There's only 4 characters in the Three Little Pigs. There's the 3 pigs and the wolf. So in other words, whenever we're writing, even if it's an abstract scientific paper, it still needs to have characters. There still has to be something or somebody that we're telling the story about. Moreover, when we think about a children's story, we keep the number of characters small. The example I like to give for this is Russian novels, because they can be so hard to read. I read Dr. Zhivago many years ago now, but it took me so many tries before I actually read it. And it's not even a very big book, but in the first 20 pages, you're introduced to hundreds of characters, and I just found myself getting exhausted. Finally, the only way I could get through it was I found a copy of the book that had a list of all of the characters. And so I was constantly, in about the first 50 pages, flipping back to that cast of characters so that I could keep track of everybody. It's much easier to understand a story that only has a small number of characters. So when you're telling a story about, say, a scientific experiment, you want to keep your cast of characters small. In other words, the number of characters that are in the subject position should be small. It doesn't have to always be the same words, but they should refer to the same things. And then finally, the characters need to act or be acted upon. There has to be action in the story, and as I said before, that action should be in the verb position. So the characters that you choose for the story should do things. So thinking again about the Three Little Pigs, they build houses, and the wolf, he blows them down and eats the pigs. That's a good story. A little violent, but it's a good story. Things happen, right? And that's the point, is the characters in a story do stuff, right? And even if you're telling a story about something really abstract, you still want it to do things. Now, there is a hierarchy to this, though. There are some characters that are easier to tell stories about than others. First and second person, it's really easy to tell stories about that. So, we are used to thinking of ourselves or the people that we interact with as being characters, as doing things, as having stories about them. So a lot of the stories we tell to our friends are about ourselves. And we're used to having our friends tell us stories about themselves, right? So that I and you, I should say, those are good characters. It's easy to tell stories about them. So think about all of the novels that have been written in first person. In textbooks, it's also very common to use second person because, again, that's a character that's easy to tell a story about. Now, I should add, though, that for whatever reason, in a research paper, second person is out. But you can tell stories about first person, either first person singular, I, or first person plural, we. And the we includes the reader often. And so in that case, you can bring in the reader without directly addressing them with you. Now, you may have been told that in some scientific writing, you should avoid the first person. And that's probably true of some research papers. So I've worked, for example, with students from the engineering department, and they tell me that it is nearly unheard of for an engineering paper to use the first person. If that's the case, then avoid it. But if you find that the papers you're reading, that some of them use the first person, then that gives you license to use it, and it's a good character, right? So when you're telling a story about a science experiment that you performed, you can put yourself into that if it's allowed within the field that you're working in. Otherwise, people are good characters for stories, much better than animals, as it turns out. Now, you might object, we've been using the example of the three little pigs and the wolf as being good characters, but the fact is, they're not really animals in those stories. They're really humans in animal form, right? They build houses, they talk. Those are not normal animal behaviors. You can tell stories about animals doing animal things, but it's harder because we think of people as being more active, as our story characters more often than not. Concrete objects are even harder to tell stories about. Doesn't mean we can't, right? I recall as a kid, there was a story that was one of my favorites, was about a red balloon and a little boy chasing the red balloon, but the red balloon was in some ways the main character of the story. It worked. The red balloon did things, though. And that's the key, is that if you want to tell a story about concrete objects like hydrogen and oxygen, then hydrogen and oxygen better be doing things. And then finally, there's abstractions like education. Education, again, it's going to be more challenging to tell a story about something abstract that is not tangible, that doesn't seem to have any free will. But we can tell stories about entropy. We can tell stories about nominalizations and so on, as long as we make them actors that are performing actions. So again, this is our hierarchy. And I should note, this hierarchy, it exists. We find this in language after language, that many aspects of language are dictated according to this hierarchy. In some languages, especially some American Indian languages, this hierarchy is actually baked into the grammar. All right, but I do want to re-emphasize that the hierarchy does not mean that you can't tell stories about objects or abstractions, only that it will be harder to make them into characters. And the way that we make them into characters is to combine them with good active verbs. As long as we do that, we can tell a good story about anything.